At this point in Unit 4, this is where we start to get into the really important stuff. You're going to learn about chromatic scales, the circle of fifths, major scales, and minor scales. So Chapter 15 is going to focus on the chromatic scale, which is the basis for most of our Western music. Chapter 16 will focus on the circle of fifths, which helps us to understand how to read and write and create major and minor scales. And then Chapter 17 and 18 will focus on our major and minor scales. So in Chapter 15, we're going to start with a discussion of the chromatic scale, then move on to the concept of sharps and flats, then talk about missing accidentals. Then we'll move on to a very important musical figure named Boethius, and finally we'll talk about Musica FICTA. So the chromatic scale is the basis for the Western musical system. It consists of 12 unique notes arranged in a consecutive manner from the lowest to the highest pitch in the scale. So these 12 pitches are equally spaced in half steps. If you remember the piano keyboard, moving from one key to the next, from a white key to a black key to another white key, or in some cases from a white key to a white key if there is no black key in between. Every time you move from one key to the next one, it's a half step. So our scale had to be tempered from the natural overtone series to create equally spaced half steps. In natural scale, the half steps are not equal. So we had to adjust the distance between each pitch to create our major and minor scales, which makes it an imperfect scale, but it also allows us to create a wide variety of music. So tempering the scale provided a compromise between a true natural scale, one that you would find in nature, and one that was playable on Western instruments. So the piano, the trombone, the trumpet, the clarinet, the flute. The violin can actually play every note in existence, but not every instrument has the versatility of a string instrument. So the system was tempered in a way that the initial overtones, which are the perfect octave, the perfect fifth, and the perfect fourth, maintained their original relationship to the natural overtone series. This is one of the reasons why these are considered perfect intervals, because on the one hand, they didn't have to be adjusted very much at all. When we created our tempered system, we were able to keep the first couple overtones in our series the same. So we had our octave first, and then we had a fifth above that octave, and then we had a fourth above that fifth. And this allows them to be considered perfect intervals because they basically don't have to be adjusted. So the scale extends one octave and includes all of the pitch classes used in common era Western music. So when I say the scale, I'm referring to the chromatic scale. The convention is to use sharps when you're going up and flats when you're going down the scale. So this format helps to prevent the unnecessary use of natural signs to cancel out a flat or a sharp. So if you use flats going up, it wouldn't technically be wrong if you got all the notes correct, but it would require you to use a natural sign after every flat sign to indicate the next note in the series. So if you had an E flat going up to E natural, you'd have to put a natural sign in. If you used a D sharp going to E natural, then you wouldn't need a natural sign on the E. It just makes it easier and more clear for the performer if you use sharps ascending and flats descending. So the chromatic scale consists of 12 notes equally spaced a half step apart to form a complete octave in a hierarchy of pitch. We're just going to summarize some of these points before showing you the actual chromatic scale. The natural scale, produced by overtones, must be tempered, which basically means adjusted, to create a chromatic scale where every pitch is spaced equally, apart from the previous pitch. This makes it possible to create large-scale works with multiple instruments. Without this, it would be very hard to have an entire orchestra playing at the same time because the trumpets may have different tunings than the violins or the piano or any other instrument that they have to play along with. It's important to note that it's not a perfect system, as it does eliminate many tones that could be used in a musical work, but it is a system that we have developed, and there's actually more information on this in the textbook, and you can learn about what a perfect scale would actually look like and how many notes there'd be in it. But for the purpose of just learning the chromatic scale, that's not really necessary information. So when it comes to sharps and flats, notice how the chromatic scale consists of 12 unique pitches ascending, not counting the octave, and 12 unique pitches descending. Look at the top line, where you have a C. It's actually a C4. It's in the 4th octave register. It moves up to a C sharp, and then a D, and then a D sharp, and then an E. Notice there is no E sharp because E sharp on the piano, if you look at the piano, the E is a white key. The key right next to that E is another white key, which is F. There is no E sharp on the piano, so we don't write an E sharp in the chromatic scale either. If you wrote an E sharp, it would actually be an F. So remember, that's an enharmonic spelling. And this is one thing that does tend to confuse people at first. If you're writing out your chromatic scale and you have more than 12 pitches, you did something wrong. So then the F moves to F sharp. And just to focus on that for a moment, if you did something wrong, more than likely you missed one of the enharmonic pitches. And it's generally going to be from E to F that you screw up, or B to C. So then F sharp goes to G goes to G sharp to A to F sharp, A sharp to B, and then we have another C. That C is actually going to be C5. Remember from octave registers, you just go up one number when you go up an octave. So now descending, we use flats. So C, B, B flat, A flat, G, G flat, F. Again, there's no F flat because that would actually be E natural. And then from E to E flat to D, D to D flat, and D flat to C. So that's a complete chromatic scale. You'd write it going up using sharps and down going using flats. So if you use an unconventional usage to write out the chromatic scale, this is what you'd end up with. If you had C going to D flat, then you'd have to indicate a D natural in the next measure. Now, since it's a new measure, you technically don't have to put that natural sign in, but it may cause confusion if you don't indicate that accidental should be there, the natural sign in the third measure. We call that a courtesy accidental, and sometimes you'll see these courtesy accidentals written in parentheses, but not always. So we move from C to D flat, courtesy accidental to indicate that we have a D natural there. Then we move to E flat, and E natural, another courtesy accidental, then F, G flat, G, A flat, A, B flat, B, and C. So you can imagine if all these notes were in the same measure, how all those accidentals could start to make it confusing for the performer to read. Same thing with descending. It's better to use flats. Otherwise, you have C, B, A sharp, then you need to put in an A natural, and then G sharp, and then a G natural, which would normally be unnecessary. Then from G to F sharp to F natural, down to E, to D sharp, and then a D natural to remind the performer not to play a D sharp, then a C sharp and a C natural. So it's easier to simply use sharps going up and flats going down. And just one more time, I'm going to really try and send this point home. It's important to put a sharp or a flat between each scale degree except for E to F and B to C, because E to F and B to C, those are already half steps. You don't need an E sharp. Remember, an E sharp would be F, a B sharp would be C, a C flat would be B, an F flat would be E. This should all be review though. So here's just a summary of what I've been telling you. The most important thing you should take away from this lecture. The decision to use a sharp or flat is a complex one that is based on many factors. Flats may indicate an impending descent in the melody. We often, especially in chromatic music, where we don't have a major or minor scale that's being used and there's a lot of chromatic pitches in there, flats may indicate that the melody is descending. Sharps may indicate that the melody is ascending. And in music that uses a key signature, the sharps or flats from the key are generally used. So if you have a key with an F sharp and a C sharp, you're not going to want to use a G flat and a D flat. You'll want to use the F sharp and the C sharp instead. You just want to keep everything as simple as possible. There are other reasons to use sharps or flats, and those have to do with more advanced theory topics that may indicate how a piece is progressing, how the chords are formed, but that's a little bit beyond the scope of this course. That would be something we'd have to discuss at a much, much later time in a completely different course. So Boethius. He was a famous theorist that lived during the 6th century and contributed a series of writings on music. He lived from about 480 to 524 AD. He was really busy. He was a Roman senator, a consul, a magister, and philosopher. One of his most important books is De Institutione Musica. It was written in the early 6th century. So this important theory text describes a system of music notation with an extended alphabet used in ancient Greece. There's a lot more information on this in the textbook, but very quickly. In ancient Greece, musical systems were very different from our modern system of notation and used primarily for theoretical purposes and instructing young musicians. In Book 4 of his 5-volume text, there are 3 methods that are outlined to describe scales. And the takeaway here is that these scales are based on the notational system of ancient Greece, and it's also important to know that notation in ancient Greece wasn't used to preserve a musical work. It was primarily used for theory training and theoretical purposes. So they didn't really record their music in written form in 480 to 524 AD in that time period in general. It's important to note that accidentals have been in use since the medieval period, way before the creation of our tempered system, but it was in the 19th century that the current usage became standardized. So originally, our B natural was written as a square-shaped B. It was known as P quadratum or B durum. The B flat was represented by a rounded B. It was known as B rotunda or B molle. The note F never used an accidental since the accidental was implied based on known conventions of the time. So in order to read music in the medieval period, you really had to understand how the musical line functioned, what key you're in, although they didn't use keys back then. But there were a lot of factors that helped musicians just know how to read the music. You have to remember, music back then was more an oral tradition, and anything that was written down was just used to help them remember a piece because they really memorized it, and that's how they performed and preserved their music, by passing it down to other musicians. Musica ficta is the last thing you need to know about, and all it means is originally accidentals were not included in the music. When we did start to use accidentals, they called it musica ficta. So musica ficta also has different meanings depending on the time period. Again, this is a complex subject. There's more information in the textbook. But before the 16th century, it referred to any note that didn't fall within the system used by the Guidonian hand. After the 16th century, it refers to any notes that fall outside of the scale or mode in a composition. So essentially, scales or modes have certain notes that are sharp or flat, and they're always the same for that scale or mode. If there were notes that didn't occur naturally in that scale or mode, we'd call that musica ficta after the 16th century. So B flat was originally used to avoid the tritone that occurs between the notes F and B in the Lydian scale. And in a lot of cases, musicians just knew we're not going to play or sing a tritone, so they just knew where they need to include a flat. Accidentals were only used when necessary, and they could never be used on the first note of the mode or the tonic of a scale, since this would change the pitch center of the piece. So you can't change the first scale degree in Ionian because it's no longer Ionian at that point. It's actually turning into more of a Locrian scale, but it changes the sequence of half steps and whole steps that occur naturally in these modes and scales. And the first and fifth scale degree are 2 scale degrees you really can't change without changing the sound of the harmony and the entire integrity of the mode or scale that you're working with. it was more permissible to change other notes within the scale, but even then it was used very cautiously. And that's a little bit too in depth to get into in this course, but just know that accidentals were not originally included in music, and when they were included, it was called Musica Ficta.